Okay, part two of the week five content for social psych. We're talking about attitudes and persuasion, and in particular, we're talking about attitudes and behavior, and the idea that if we have an attitude towards something, that should predict our behavior. So the theories say, at least the early theories, but the evidence is that they very rarely predict it very well. So we're just about to now, we've started talking about the conditions under which that attitude behavior link appears. So rather than the if it appears, we're talking about when. So what conditions are necessary. So the most famous theoretical model that we have for this is called the theory of planned behavior. So Asgen and Fishbane in the late 70s observed that the correspondence between attitudes and behavior, so attitudes towards an object and the behavior towards that object, had to be high. So the correspondence between them had to be high before the attitudes would predict the behavior. And so this led them to put together this theory of planned behavior and to try and capture the attitude behavior link. So this is going to be hard to read for you, unfortunately. So this one here, these are the three components here that we now know we need to look at together in order to be able to predict intentions, and that we can then use intentions to predict actual behavior. So this is intended behavior and this is actual behavior. So originally the link was here between this red square, attitudes towards the behavior, predicting the behavior directly. We now know that attitudes predict intentions. So my attitude towards a certain political issue might predict my intention to vote a certain way, and my intention to vote predicts the actual vote itself. So this blue square here is talking about the subjective norms around an attitude, and the orange box at the bottom, or the yellow box at the bottom, is the perceived behavioral control. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this model in terms of the way, let's use the smoking example again. So in order to predict whether or not we will quit smoking, we first need to be able to predict our intentions to quit smoking, right? And so the three things that we need to know: our attitude towards smoking. So before we can actually quit smoking, we need to change our attitude towards smoking. So we need to decide that it is actually bad for us and that we don't like that it's bad for us, right? So the attitudes need to be more negative than positive, right? Then we need to consider, let's do the perceived behavioral control first, right? So the perceived behavioral control. Do I believe that I'm capable of giving up smoking? Right? Do I think that I've got, have I equipped myself with the things I need? I've got, tobacco, what's it called? Nicorette gum, for example, or I guess more importantly, do I believe that I've got the motivation to do it? Then the third interesting component here, this subjective norms one, this is the one that's really the most interesting from a social psychological perspective, the subjective norms. Do the people who are important to me think the same thing? Right, so would my mother or my partner, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, kids, flatmates, also like it if I gave up smoking? Right, so the combination of attitude towards the behavior, thinking that the other people in your life who are important to you think the same thing, and do you believe that you have the capacity to make the change, in combination can predict your intention to do the behavior, and then this can predict the actual behavior itself. That's the theory of planned behavior. It's a very, very popular model. It's used quite commonly in health psychology research. Right, so this white box that's just popped up, it's just a couple of extra notes to this. The attitude behavior link using the theory of planned behavior can be particularly well explained if it directly affects you or your interests. So, if it's going to impact your ability to get promoted or to have children, or to find a partner, then it's going to be particularly effective, this theory. If your attitudes are deeply held, if they're really, really strong to you, and the third point is if it concerns your nearest and dearest. So this is kind of related to the subjective norms. Cool. So these dot points here. There is solid evidence that attitudes correlate with behaviors, right? Solid evidence. It happens fairly consistently with a correlation coefficient of 0.3. right? So a weak to moderate correlation. If we calculate this out to account for the variance accounted for, so the overlapping or the shared variance between our attitudes and our behaviors, that's somewhere between about 4 and 9%. So our attitudes can account for about less than 10% of our behaviors, right? So as a defining feature of attitudes, behavior is not a good link. And the reverse is true as well. As a defining feature of behavior, attitudes are not great. So we need to start thinking about some other models. So in the 90s, Fazio came up with this mode model of attitudes. Mode standing for motivation and opportunity as determinants of attitudes. Right? So this is what we call a single attitude model. So the idea is that we have a single attitude towards an attitude object, and it varies as a function of how much time we've had to think about it, sort of, right? So bear with me while I explain this. The mode model of attitudes, or any single attitude model, has this idea that our implicit attitudes, as measured by the implicit association test, the IAT, or the go-no-go association task, the NAT, as we would have done in many of our first and second year lab reports, implicit attitudes are measured early, right? So this is the automatic response to the attitude object, right? So I flash a picture of a kitten at you, and your immediate response is, oh, that's so cute, right? A positive attitude, right? So your automatic, early, implicit evaluation of that attitude object is a positive one, right? And then our explicit attitudes come later down the track. You know, it might just be 1 or 2 seconds later, it could be 10 seconds, it could be an hour later, is when you're asked to verbalize that attitude. So either to say what you think about that attitude object, or, you know, on a scale from 1 to 5, write down what you think of it. That's our explicit attitude, right? And so for Fazio, the idea of whether an implicit attitude and an explicit attitude should be the same or not depends on whether you feel obliged to change your explicit attitude, to modify your response based on things like, you know, is that an acceptable attitude to have? You know, a social desirability concern. Who else is in the room? Who's watching? Who's going to be evaluating my attitude? Those are the sorts of things that will change, right? So for Fazio, the implicit attitude is the early automatic response, and it can't be changed. But, you know, if let's say that you're a highly sexist person, your implicit attitude towards women would be negative, but you might be aware that in the context of a social psychology class at university, you shouldn't say that you're sexist, so you would lie, basically, or you would make your attitudes more positive than they are, right? And so for Fazio, the implicit and explicit attitudes don't always correlate highly, and that can explain the difference between when attitudes do and don't predict behavior, right? Brian Nosek, you know, 20 odd years later, came up with a somewhat similar model, which said that implicit and explicit attitudes, they are distinct from each other, but they're related constructs, right? So here's a very brief recap of all of that. The stimulus is there, or the attitude object is there. We have an immediate automatic response to it, you know, how we feel about it, how we react to it. That's our implicit attitude. And then down the track a little bit further is our explicit attitudes once we've had time to think about that, right? Conversely to these single attitude models are dual attitude models, right? So dual attitude models basically say that towards any attitude object, we can have an explicit and an implicit attitude that coexist in memory, but they're actually entirely separate constructs, right? They just happen to be towards the same attitude object, right? So the argument by people like Wilson, Lindsay, and Schooler is that our explicit attitudes and our implicit attitudes might be correlated, they might not be, and that's just because sometimes your explicit and your implicit attitudes are both happen to be negative or both happen to be positive, right? But these guys will argue that our attitudes are formed, our explicit and implicit attitudes are formed differently, they're triggered by different things, and they don't need to be related, right? So the idea for them is that We might be implicitly racist because we grew up hearing a lot of racist jokes or seeing a lot of racist behaviors, but that we personally might actually be really motivated to be egalitarian. And so if our implicit attitudes are stored in long-term memory, they're harder to change, but our motivations to be not racist might mean that we have positive explicit attitudes, but negative implicit attitudes. Right, so the big distinction, a dual model of attitudes says that implicit and explicit attitudes are different things towards this, different attitudes, different constructs towards the same object. Cool. The idea here is that where a dual attitude exists, implicit attitudes are automatic and explicit attitudes require brain resources, cognitive resources, such as capacity and motivation. And so when these things exist at the same time, if explicit attitudes become accessible, they override implicit attitudes, and then the explicit attitude is what guides the behavior. Right? So once they've become accessible, the explicit attitudes are what guide the behavior rather than the implicit ones. Right? And so the effect of implicit attitudes are uncontrollable. Cool. And then the final thing that we'll say about this is that explicit attitudes can change, and they can change quite easily. But implicit attitudes, they take a long time to form, and so they're resistant to change. A bit like a bad habit. We can do it with time, we can do it with practice, but it's certainly not an easy or quick feat. Cool. A little bit about how we might measure each of these. So an explicit attitude is what we call a non-reactive attitude, and we measure it typically using an explicit scale. So something like a Likert scale, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much do you agree or disagree with this sentence? We might have a picture of something and then a 1 to 5 scale underneath that ranges from positive to negative. Or we have these other more modern measures that we've talked about last week, which are still explicit measures, but they ask us questions that are slightly less controversial. If you're into the error choice method, have a quick look through the textbook at this. It is worth a look. We have indirect measures which fall into the implicit-ish category. So my favorite example of this is the word completion task. So if you look at this little thing here, and I ask you to fill in the blank, you might have decided to say you would fill it with a double S. And if I asked you to fill in this one, you almost certainly would do that. But the alternative is you might have filled it with double L. Right, and the idea is that the way you complete this is some kind of an indication of what you're thinking at the time. So kill is a index of aggression, whereas kiss might be an index of positive attitudes. Right, or if you happened to be Scottish, you might have finished it with kilt, and that would be an index of your national identification. Right, so these are a little bit, they're hard to predict, they're hard to score, but they're still quite useful and quite a non-invasive type of a measure. We can do similar kinds of things with sentence unscramble, or we can ask people to rate how famous certain pictures or names are, and these can give us an index of our attitudes towards them as well. Then the more legit, I'm going to call them implicit measures, include things like our priming tools, our priming tasks. So affective priming, semantic priming, the weapon detection stuff that we talked about last week. We also have things like the Stroop task, which is an example of an inhibition measure. We also have facilitation measures like the IAT and the NAT. I'm not going to go into those too much. And then some combination tools, but I'm not going to talk about those today either. Right, so we've done a lot on the facilitation stuff. I just want to explain to you quite quickly how the priming tasks work. So Fazio, the same guy who came up with the mode model of attitudes, came up with this affective priming task. Right, so it's an experimental task. This is an example of the task sequence. So it's a computer task. You have a fixation time where you're asked just to look at this screen that looks like this, and in the center there's a row of asterisks or stars. Then at a certain point, there will be a prime, right? And so this example here, we've been primed with a picture of an African-American face at a subliminal level, so 315 milliseconds. So for the person doing this, the participant, it would look to them like the screen flickers. So they can't see that there's a picture of a black person there, but what they can see is that something's happened. But subliminally, they've been exposed to an African-American face. And all of the stereotypes that we don't necessarily endorse, but we do know exist, such as aggression and violence, can be activated in the mind. Then there's an interstimulus interval of 135 milliseconds, so it's even faster, and then a word appears on the screen. Right, and the participant has up to 2.5 seconds to classify that word as being either a positive word or a negative word. Right, and the idea is that if the prime, which in this case was a blackface, is perceived by the participant as being a bad thing, then they've been primed to think bad, and then when that word appears here, it would be easier for them to respond to a negative word than a positive word, or it's going to take them longer to switch from bad to good in their mind. Right, so this would be what we call an incongruent combination. Right, so that's the affective priming task. Similar thing is the semantic priming task. So we have again the fixation period, but this time of exactly 1 second. Then there'll be the prime. So again, it could be faces, but it could be words. And then there'll be a mask. So the participant will see flash, flash. And what it will actually be is the word black and then these asterisks, but they'll probably just think that it's the screen flickering. That's there for 2 seconds. And then they're asked, then they've shown a word, and they're asked to just classify that as a real word or a nonsense word. So you can see that this combination of letters actually says the word athletic. So you would classify that as a real word. But if it said ATHECLTX, you know, it would look like a real word, but it's not a real word. So you'd call it a nonsense word. Right. And so actually, we're not interested so much in whether people can get that correct or not, but we're interested in knowing if this word here is facilitated by this prime. So the stereotypes around black people is that they are athletic. So this was what we would call a congruent combination. So you get the fixation, you're primed with the word black, which activates all of the stereotypes around black people, and then you're asked to classify the word athletic. Right, so the idea is if this word was white, if the prime was white, this would be slower, a slower response. Right, and here's an example of what the screen looks like for an IAT. We did this last week, so I'm not going to go through it again, and we already know how the NAT works. I'm not going to talk about this in the lecture notes, but you'll see that there's a whole slide here on the pros and the cons of the IAT. Right, so just as a reminder, the IAT got in first. It's the most popular implicit measure, but probably purely by because of the fact that it was the first one around. Right, if in my opinion and in many other people's opinions, the NAT is by far superior in terms of its methodologies, and it has less limitations. Cool. That's it for attitudes. I'm going to finish this particular recording, and then in the next one, we're going to be talking about the link between attitudes to attitude objects, and in particular, attitude change. Right, so this is when we're going to be talking about persuasion. So we're going to be talking about the approach, the source, the message, the evidence, and the audience.